Good morning. Global Digital Human Rights Network is part of European Union cooperation in science and technology framework. We are currently uniting more than 100 human rights researchers and practitioners from about 40 countries. When the network was started about 1.5 years ago, we were perhaps naively expecting that we will be able to address issues which are bright, forward-looking, and idealistic. But we have been called on several occasions to deal with matters which are dark, painful, and very practical. Today, the network will present findings and conclusions of a comparative study into how governments, legacy media, and private social portals have reacted to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I am honored to give word for the opening statement to Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Eva-Maria Liimets.
Dear Professor Susi, dear participants of today's seminar, first I would like to thank the Tallinn University and the Global Digital Human Rights Network for organizing this webinar. The topic of our discussion is most pertinent as we are witnessing horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity, genocide, perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. Exactly a year ago, as I was invited to provide opening remarks in a similar setting on the topic of human rights aspects of the COVID-19 immunization passports, the world was already in turmoil. The pandemic had worsened the human rights situation in more than 80 countries, including due to restrictions on media freedom. Now, there are no more illusions where Russia's use of its propaganda machinery, long-standing and coordinating disinformation campaigns against Ukraine and suppression of free journalism in Russia was planned to lead to. Russia was creating false pretexts to attempt to justify their illegal and immoral acts and to try concealing all the atrocities they are committing in Ukraine. Mid-February of this year, as Estonia hosted the Global Conference on Media Freedom in Tallinn, Nobel Peace Prize winner Dmitry Muratov talked about the more than concerning developments in Russia. Last week, as one of the few independent journalists still remaining in Russia, Muratov was attacked and doused with acetone and red paint aboard a train in Moscow. This is completely unacceptable, as is the detention of opposition activist and journalist Vladimir Kara-Murza to silence him. There is no doubt that independent media has a crucial role in all societies. Media freedom, internet freedom, freedom of expression at large are the core for a free world, for a free mind. They constitute what democracy is and serve for each and every one of us as the foundation to make informed decisions. Clearly, though, it is not the case in Russia, as by now the information is almost entirely controlled by the state after introducing full censorship laws and blocking social media. Therefore, the sanctions on Russia's state-owned pro-Kremlin channels is the only logical outcome in fighting their propaganda. Limiting pro-Kremlin Russian-language TV channels broadcasting in Estonia has been a subject of discussion for years. But without delay, within 24 hours after Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine started, the Estonian Consumer Protection and Technical Regulatory Agency issued a directive to stop access to 5 Russian TV stations and 1 Belarusian TV station in Estonian territory. The limitations have been widened thus far. It is encouraging to see similar decisions taken in a number of other countries. Protection of journalists was one of the most prominent issues discussed in the Tallinn conference in February. Journalists and media workers must be allowed to safely carry out their self-sacrificing work, particularly in times of conflict or war. As Russia is brutally targeting civilian population in Ukraine, it has also shown complete disregard to the lives and rights of journalists in blatant violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. According to Reporters Without Borders, 7 reporters have been killed and 11 injured in Ukraine since 24th of February this year. Too many lives of excellent journalists cut short while bringing us the truth of Russia's horrific war on Ukraine. We cannot overestimate the true value of the information gathered by journalists in Ukraine. While they are relentlessly shedding light on Russia's crimes against humanity, they also collect evidence for future trials, for example, by the International Criminal Court. There is a broad global consensus that the role of media and internet is to first and foremost inform its citizens. The difference arises in the extent to what degree this information is controlled and managed. Estonia has the second freest internet according to Freedom House and is ranking in the top 15 on the World Press Freedom Index. It is clear that for us, ensuring the freedom of expression in all forms is of crucial importance. Russia can be found in the bottom of these lists, and a large number of UN member states has recently once again deplored Russia's actions by suspending its membership in the Human Rights Council. Thank you, and I wish good discussion.
Thank you very much, Minister Liimets, for setting the context for today's webinar. The study which we are going to introduce and discuss was initiated almost immediately after the start of the aggression. We have information from 29 countries and 53 scholars contributed to this study. Out of those 29 countries, 19 are European Union member countries and 10 are not. The order of today will be that my co-editors will introduce respective issues which were explored in the study. Thereafter, we have the possibility to listen to remarks and statements from 3 distinguished individuals, and thereafter we have the floor for discussion. All participants are able to pose questions through the webinar homepage. Let us proceed. I'm now introducing my dear friend from Liimets Institute of Media Research, Professor Matthias Kettemann.
Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for having me. This is such an important study, and I'm very happy to present the first 2 questions we've asked researchers. The researchers in our study focused inter alia on the question of what position the respective governments had on the EU-wide ban on Russian and Russian state-sponsored media, and whether a public debate had had taken place in their respective countries. We identified two major currents. There were a number of countries that supported the ban quite openly, and a not unsubstantial number of countries that remained rather neutral or did not involve themselves in the public debate. We saw that the EU-wide ban on Russian-sponsored media was widely accepted, and only few governments took position against that, mainly outside of Europe. Public debates appeared rather restrained. The majority of our researchers could confirm that their respective governments and national media supported EU activities against Russian state media. Those happened either through national measures by national media regulators, or directly through companies such as satellite providers. Some countries haven't taken public positions on the media ban. That might sometimes be related to federal structures where the government could not implement the ban directly, but rather state media regulators were responsible. If there was criticism, that criticism against the ban was related more to competence issues and focused on the importance of free media and information rights more generally. In a couple of European countries, journalists' organizations voiced criticism against the ban based on the primacy of the rights to information. Non-European countries, non-EU countries, like Norway, aligned themselves with a lot of EU sanctions against Russia, but specifically did not ban the Russian media outlets. Non-European countries like Argentina and South Africa, in our study, showed themselves to be rather neutral and to some extent sympathetic to Russian media outlets. The question of how to react to disinformation was, of course, at the background of this first question. The second question I've been asked to provide a little summary for is related to the underlying question whether national researchers thought that their laws against disinformation were sufficient. Now, the fight against disinformation is obviously extremely important in light of the current information ecosystem. However, researchers pointed out that national legislation usually does not provide specific remedies for disinformation outside of specific circumstances, such as clear threats connected to disinformation or specific pieces of disinformation regarding a person. The more intensive reaction, let's say, or let me put that differently, the impact that disinformation has on national discourses, however, is usually not remedied by national laws, because national constitutions and the constitutional guarantees for freedom usually forbid intervention by governments in discourses. Here, the European Union and its activities to fight against disinformation were pointed out by a number of countries as important guidelines, including activities like EU versus Disinfo, affiliated to the European External Action Service. Researchers in many countries pointed out that they believe the current situation was not ideal, and that especially the freedom given to platforms to deal with disinformation led to the primacy of their economic interests over interests such as national social cohesion within countries. The researchers finally also found that in any national way how disinformation is addressed, a balance has to be struck between the different rights involved, human rights to information, to expression, but also the rights that can be endangered by disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kettermann. We are proceeding, and now I give floor to Gregor Fischer, researcher at the University of Graz. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, it is a pleasure for me too to be here today to present parts of this very important study. The first one I'm going to introduce to you was the question whether national media regulatory agencies have become active in the case of disinformation in relation to the war in Ukraine. And obviously, as most EU member states simply did a transposition of the EU sanctions into national regulatory action. That was the case, and agencies in, for example, Austria, Croatia, France, and Germany have done the communication of the sanctions to the norm addressees, and so hence they have been very active. Some EU member states, on the other hand, acted even before that, and the regulatory agencies took a particularly active role in that. These were Belgium, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The most prominent case here being Latvia, banning 60 programs, half of which were Russian, already in the past 3 years, so hence well before the Russian invasion. The majority of non-EU countries, on the other hand, have not imposed any media sanctions. There we have the United Kingdom standing out as a counterexample, where the media regulator Ofcom has opened 27 investigations altogether against Russia today. And as well, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, has halted all content licensing with Russian customers. So analytically, from that we can draw 3 conclusions. The first being rather mundane and obvious, namely that the EU countries transposed EU law quickly, and so their regulatory agencies have acted in line with that. Second, the higher the geographical and linguistic proximity to Russia becomes, the more expedient and far-reaching responses have been from regulatory agencies. And third, countries, for example, in the Balkans, have displayed a reluctancy to impose media sanctions. Outstanding examples of that were Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova, and Serbia. We can explain that maybe through a historical tie to the Russian Federation. Another question that we have sent out to our participants was whether their country has a specific procedure in place for coordination with social media corporations during times of crisis. None of the surveyed states has displayed such a specific procedure, and national procedures rather applied generally, and then to specific content or situations, which is hate speech, data protection, and disinformation in connection with elections, for example. So a situation of crisis per se is not regulated. One state, however, Latvia, managed to enter into an ad hoc agreement with YouTube to block the channels forbidden in the state, also on social media, also on this social media outlet, most importantly, Russia Today, which I've mentioned before. In our analysis, we have found that national laws enabling states to restrict media broadcasting were rarely used by EU states. So the EU legislation has overridden the national laws that apply generally. And we noted that the application of general laws in general is preferable to such ad hoc legislation. Additionally, and importantly, we found that lawmakers should bear in mind the dual publication channels used by classical media, so that these media also use social media outlets, So coordination with social media platforms is in order and important also in times of crises. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Fischer, and we are proceeding. Now I call on Dr. Birgit Schippers from University of Strathclyde to present the findings of her group. Please.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important webinar. I will also introduce responses to 2 questions that we sent out to our academic contributors. The first question that we have asked the collaborating researchers to address was whether governments have proposed or taken additional domestic measures to regulate either social media accounts or media channels in response to the armed conflict in Ukraine. And the responses that we received to this question can be broadly grouped into 3 categories. First of all, it's important to state that the vast majority of governments did not propose or introduce domestic legislation that was specifically aimed at platform regulation or social media regulation in response to the war in Ukraine. So this was the first group of responses. The second response, or the second group, includes states, including European Union member states, that adopted the EU sanctions on Kremlin-backed outlets, Russia Today and Sputnik. Now, at the time of submission, when our researchers submitted their responses, these sanctions have not yet been fully implemented in all EU member states. There's a small group of states, a small number of states, and they tend to be located within geographical proximity to Russia, which actually introduced domestic legislative changes. For example, via amendments to existing laws in the case of Estonia and Latvia, by introducing a state of emergency that extends to the control of broadcasting and social media, as in the case of Lithuania, or by conferring additional powers on security agencies that monitor the media coverage of the war. This was a response we received from Moldova. Additionally, there were several governments that asked their respective national regulators to ban or block access to Russian TV stations. And we also received responses which indicated that regional bodies, for example, regional parliaments in the case of Belgium, which asked the national government to take all possible measures against Russian disinformation and also to advocate for a stronger EU response. Now, one of the interesting findings that we received, that there was very little evidence that governments provided legal argumentation that underpinned perhaps a social media ban. Now, one of the explanations is simply because of the relatively low number of domestic legislative responses. What we found much more was that governments embarked on political justifications for media bans, and these tended to be pitched at a wider public. For example, concerns over Russian disinformation and propaganda. Where states introduced domestic legislation or amended legislation, they justified those changes with reference, for example, to threats to national security and public safety in the case of Latvia, concerns over incitement to hatred in the case of Moldova, or in the case of Estonia, to securing, and I quote, morality and lawfulness in the provision of media services. I also looked at the role of civil society organizations and trusted flaggers in reporting online hate speech as a result of the war in Ukraine. And again, really interesting findings in that most submissions did not report a surge in online hate speech. However, this response or these responses need to be qualified insofar as the responses suggest a lack of reliable data. In fact, we only received 2 responses from Latvia and Poland, where the researchers drew directly on research findings that documented online hate speech. And this was primarily directed at Ukrainian refugees, at nationals supporting Ukrainian refugees, and at the Polish and Ukrainian states. One other interesting finding that I want to highlight here is refers to the actions of the Anti-Discrimination Office of Styria, a region in Austria. They registered an increase in online hate speech and offline hate crimes as well, which can be reported via an app. And I think this is something that needs to be monitored more closely, and we'll see what results come out of this development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Birgit. We are proceeding. Professor Jukka Viljanen, University of Tampere. The floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity to give our findings. I introduce also 2 questions. First, we had a question, have elected officials promoted contradicted bans on Russian associated media in your country or the EU? And there seems to be wide consensus amongst elected officials that bans of Russian and associated media have been appropriate and necessary. In small number of countries, representatives of opposition parties have been critical of these bans. Some countries outside of the EU have not introduced bans on Russian associated media and have based this approach on the argument of neutrality. On this analysis, we of course found that reasons of this consensus on these Russian bans against Russians were based on how closely Russian associated media outlets are to Russian state authorities, and therefore are not considered to disseminate accurate news and information, but instead providing disinformation and propaganda through the broadcasting. Even some elected representatives are saying that these bans are strengthening free and independent media. There are only marginal voices, opposition voices, that have been critical of the actions taken. This is mostly based on this idea of neutrality in countries like Austria. In some countries, such as Lithuania, the criticism is more reflection of the scope of emergency powers used than the media bans in particular. Outside of the European Union, some countries have taken a position of being neutral and therefore do not consider it necessary to issue bans. The second question, of course, is also very important. We asked, have there been specific concerns taken on acting against incitement towards ethnic minorities that have been taken by the authorities? There has not been any significant increase of incitement to hatred towards ethnic minorities due to Russian invasion of Ukraine. In some countries, politicians have addressed that there should not be attacks against Russian population, and Russian aggression should not be blamed on Russian individuals. and intelligence agencies have warned about Russia using this argumentation as a justification for further aggression, and therefore reminded the public that individual Russians are not to be blamed. So in our mind, there seems to be no major signs of any systematic incitement of hate towards ethnic minorities due to the war in Ukraine. However, in some countries, key politician leaders have addressed this issue and requested that no hatred be expressed towards Russian individuals staying in their country. There are dangerous signs that Russia uses hatred towards ethnic minorities to build false narrative in their own state propaganda and as a justification for further aggression. Intelligence agencies have warned about this tragedy and reminded us that ordinary individuals with Russian background are not responsible for the invasion. Russian embassies in some countries have used social media, Twitter, to distribute a message that they want to collect information about aggression towards Russian citizens or the Russian-speaking population. This has received strong opposition from the local Russian-speaking population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Viljanen. And now, last but not least, a few summary remarks from my side before we proceed to our guests. My group was looking into the question which was originally formulated: who acted first in initiating the ban on Russian and Belarusian legacy and social media? In terms, were these the governments or were these the private portals? Along with that question, we were asking whether private companies have made any changes in their standards governing traffic on their portals. However, in the course of the analysis, we were confronted with some surprising discoveries. To put everything into the framework, the aggression started on 24th of February, which unfortunately coincides with Estonian National Independence Day. However, already on March the 1st, European Union issued Directive 2022-350, which to be translated means that there is an imperative obligation in all EU member countries to ban access to these Russian TV and Belarusian TV stations. So the time frame was very short. Therefore, perhaps to ask if the governments were acting before they received this imperative from the EU is somewhat misleading. However, there were only 5 countries among our survey which acted within this relatively short time frame. These countries in alphabetical order were Belgium, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. We are able to explain the latter 4. I'm very pleased to see that Belgium is leading this group. After that, of course, all European countries have imposed the restriction. The legal argumentation has changed over time. Initially, one could not expect perhaps too deep argumentation, but as time has developed, more arguments to justify the ban in legal terms, strict legal terms, have been put forward. But what happened to private media companies? We have seen that with very few exceptions, none of the countries have reported that their private media companies changed anything in their standards. However, they changed something in practice. And what they changed in practice was to restrict considerably the possibility of portal users to post comments to articles or news dealing with information of the aggression. We have introduced in our study the term digital iron curtain. Perhaps it is justified to speak of this digital iron curtain, and we can see that it is imposed now both by EU governments and also through practice from private portals. But what about non-EU countries whom we surveyed? Here there is no pattern. The situation is uniform. None of the non-EU countries we surveyed have issued any restrictions or any ban on Russian or Belarusian media. None of the countries we surveyed. My group was also looking into the question whether something fundamental may change regarding freedom of expression and media freedom in this terrible war situation. And here, of course, we received different opinions. From the researchers outside of the European Union, but not only them, the idea put forward was to say that restricting totally certain TV channels puts freedom of expression in danger. And why? Because it opens the door for the governments in the future to misuse the pattern and start to restrict access to media in situations which prima facie are not as horrifying as the current one. We, of course, have countered this statement by saying that this concern remains rather abstract. There is no evidence that the governments would want to use this pattern in the future, because they have not done so in the past. The majority of countries in the democratic world have not done so. What we also have discussed, and I am confident it will be a matter of debates in the future when the aggression is over, whether the relative weight between freedom of expression and right to disseminate information, and from the other side, the value to protect national security, whether the relative weight is equal, or whether there are circumstances that we can say the need to restrict the right to disseminate information considerably weakens against the need to protect security and guarantee factually accurate information. So in our study, we suggest that there is a need to further reconsider the relative weight of conflicting rights. But now I would like to proceed to the highlight of today and give word for comments and statement to former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves.
Dear guests and panelists, I'm honored to have been asked to participate in this important panel, and especially in what is so rare in academia, a panel discussing fundamental issues in media res as they are unfolding around us. Too often we look at such issues after the fact with no possibility to alter what happened. In this case, we can in fact calibrate policies in the immediate future. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression is one of the cornerstones of liberal democracy overall and enshrined in the constitutions of all European Union member states. Indeed, it is a prerequisite, as well as in the EU Constitution, the Lisbon Treaty itself. For the purpose of this study, I think, however, we need to make a crucial distinction regarding the notion of freedom of expression. Historically, as well as legally, freedom of expression, since its beginning as a concept in the late 18th century, has been considered a human right, but it has always been an individual right. Liberal democracies cannot abridge the individual's right to freedom of expression, except in cases defined legally, such as endangering others, or in a related notion, hate speech. Holocaust denial, for example, is prohibited speech as it is incitement to violence. I am dubious, however, whether this notion of the individual's right to free expression can be extended to state-owned, state-run, or state-controlled media outlets of the kind discussed in this study. Can we say it is a matter of freedom of expression if a state-run media channel denies or lies about war crimes? If it broadcasts speech inciting citizens to hate an ethnic group or promise its destruction? Is it proper to use the term freedom of expression when we talk about a state-controlled media outlet that itself denies freedom of expression, where alternative or dissenting voices are denied any kind of platform? Indeed, can we speak at all of freedom of expression when these state-run outlets or outlets only permitted by the state, while alternatives are censored and shut down? In other words, and briefly, does freedom of expression extend to states, and especially to states that themselves allow no freedom of expression? And I think this is something that we will have to come to grips with already now, and I hope in the discussion we have today. But more broadly, I think that we need to clarify also legally what we mean by freedom of expression, whether it applies to only individuals or can we extend it to state and state-run media. Ladies and gentlemen, also, as maybe not the primary issue, but I would, in this light, I would also raise two other issues. One, which directly follows from the previous. Obvious malign intent from Russian state-run media clearly form a form of hostile actions directed at harming other countries and their population. Then one example. Throughout Europe, and most saliently in Germany, Russian state media, such as RT, has vigorously promoted COVID anti-vax propaganda, propagating the absurd claims that we have all seen elsewhere as well. At the same time, these outlets rarely, if ever, promote the other side of the debate. I use other side and debate in quotes in my talk. Meanwhile, in the state-run media's homeland, Russia, the widespread and horrific effects of the COVID pandemic has led the Russian government on its own domestic channels to threaten those who refuse to get vaccinated with dismissal from work. To me, I conclude, like it or not, the Russian message abroad is tantamount to biological warfare. it is hardly an issue of freedom of expression. The second issue touches upon regional differences. I don't think it has to do with proximity to Russia, frankly. Those countries with significant Russian minorities face altogether different challenges regarding inflammatory Russian state propaganda than those with a negligible population. Countries such as Estonia have seen up close the effects of incitement and inflammatory propaganda in Russian state media during the Bronze Soldier riots of 2007. And today we see anti-Ukrainian hate speech on local Russian language social media. These issues touch on all East European members of the EU with significant Russian minorities, as well as Germany, which too has witnessed Russian demonstrations in support of the war against Ukraine and the war crimes committed against Ukrainians. These are difficult issues, I must admit, but I'm extremely pleased that that this panel has actually chosen to discuss these issues now in a timely fashion, and I hope that out of this we will also get some policy recommendations for member states and for the European Union. So thank you for your attention.
President Ilves, thank you. Thank you very much for these insightful comments and also the questions which you have posed, which are all highly relevant and I'm confident will be discussed today and subsequently. And what comes to the recommendations, policy recommendations, indeed, the report which will be made available today includes some of those, but let those be just the start. It is now my honor to introduce our next guest speaker, Director of Strategic Communication of German Federal Government, Eva-Maria, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this most important and timely gathering. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak, and thank you very much for the work that has gone into the study, and thank you also, President Ilves, for your very pertinent remarks. And what you said last, that studies and scientific efforts such as these should also produce policy recommendations that I think I can absolutely agree. And we are looking actually to the scientific world to help us do the right thing. I do not feel up to discussing legal ramifications of what has been said, but I wanted to give you an overview of what we are doing practically, which is something that we are always trying to adjust to the newest scientific and statistical findings. We are using open source intelligent tools to look at what's being discussed mostly in social media, not so much legacy media. And we have been monitoring activities of Russian state media, both in traditional ways as well as in social media for quite some time. We are also monitoring, maybe that's interesting in this context too. We're also monitoring Chinese media, Chinese activities also in the social media. What we have noticed even before the start of the Russian aggression against Ukraine was that narratives that pretended to Ukrainian aggressions against Donetsk and Luhansk, that told tales of genocide in Donbass committed by Ukraine, and also Ukrainian plans to regain atomic arms started to be played to the foreground, to be boosted. And after the invasion started, actually, that was not such a big topic in those media as far as they were displayed in Germany. Main narratives here have been that European sanctions are mainly weakening European economy, that German economy is close to collapse, contrary to the Russian economy, which is doing fine. And something that has already been mentioned and is examined in the study, I believe, that's about aggressions against people with Russian roots in Germany. And as President Ilves has mentioned, there's quite an important community of people with Russian roots in Germany, about 3.5 million. And when we look at what they are communicating on social media, we can notice that they are quite divided, actually, into pro and counter Russian. That is interesting. I wanted to, as I said, Chinese media are interesting in that respect, because we have noticed that increasingly systematically internet actors, influencers and such are active in support of accounts that are close to the Kremlin and partly retweet and replay near exact same statements. I think that is interesting, and we are keeping a watch on that. That goes with another Russian narrative that's being hyped in social media in Germany, and that is that Russia, together with China and other BRIC countries, is preparing to be leading the world into a new world order. And that is flanked by saying, well, all the West has done is plunge the global South into hunger by starting this war, which leads to global scarcity in foodstuff. Also interesting, and I think with that I will stop this part and have only one little thing to add, is that we notice very similar Russian propaganda in the social media in Germany and in France. Main narrative here is that the majority of the population is pro-Russian and against delivering arms to Ukraine and against the sanctions. Another thing, and that's actually going to be my last phrase, I see that my time's already up, if you permit me, I'm sorry, is that we are working really hard to keep our information channels into Russia open. And maybe that is the only legal thing I will permit myself. President Ilves talked about the freedom of expression. I think if we look to Russia, our lodestar is the freedom to get information. We believe that Russians should have the freedom to get information, and that is an assumption on which we are working together with media in Germany, with non-state media in Germany, to try to find ways to circumvent internet censorship and actually keep information accessible also to Russians. Thank you very much, and forgive me for not staying within my time slot. Sorry.
Thank you very much. No problem with the time. It is important to discuss the matters in content. And now I will give floor to Louise O'Reilly, member of the Irish Parliament. The floor is yours.
Friends, good morning from Dublin. I want to thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this morning, and I want to especially thank those who made a contribution to this important study. I was very struck by a remark made by Mr. Fisher in which he highlighted the importance of coordinating with social media companies at a time of crisis. And I think in a time of crisis, we reach for the internet, we reach for our phones, we look for information, and it's becoming harder and harder to disentangle disinformation from real information. And I suppose for my part, I have worked as a Member of Parliament with content moderators who are the men and women who view the content on social media. They make a decision on publication, they make the decision to flag in the case of disinformation or indeed in the case of harmful content. And when I engaged with them, I got a very interesting insight into the attitude of social media companies to these people, to the work that they do. So I would say that, as more and more people get their news from non-traditional media sources, and more people get their news from the internet and from social media platforms, those men and women who stand between us and disinformation are extremely important. And what I have learned is that social media companies, not all, but some, do not treat these workers with any amount or degree of respect. In fact, what they have done is they have outsourced this function. So the content moderating function has been outsourced from a large number of social media platforms, which means essentially that they are outsourcing that level of governance, that level of accountability, and that layer of personnel that will look and decide on disinformation. And I think this is very disturbing. What I found also is that these men and women are required in many instances to sign non-disclosure agreements and also to commit that they will not tell anybody outside of the company who it is that they are working for or the work that they are doing. Friends, content moderators are our last line of defence. They see what we should not see. Therefore, their work protects not just protect us from harmful content, but their work can, if done right, protect us from disinformation. So in a time of crisis and in a time of war, we need to be sure of the media sources, we need to be sure of the information that we get, and content moderators play a very, very key role in that. And the attitude, I think, of social media companies to this function tells us a lot about the work that needs to be done to ensure that, yes, absolutely, we protect freedom of expression, but we also ensure that we are protected against disinformation, which is absolutely essential. I suppose when I talk about the content moderators, I always have to point out the fact that very often they are young people. They don't undergo specific training, and yet they are put in this situation whereby they are now an extremely important part of a an information machine, but also a disinformation machine. And this is where, and I welcome this study and the fact now that we are looking, and this conversation is starting in relation to, the role of media and the link with the state. So if you take that the social media companies have put their content moderators at one remove, the state in many instances put themselves at one remove. So there are different sources of information. Some of those are private. We absolutely have to protect the freedom of expression, and I understand that, but we also need to ensure that the social media companies are playing their part and that they're doing their bit. But we can't do that if the state is at a remove from the social media platforms and the social media platforms are at a remove from the content moderators. Then it becomes even the site of and the chance to catch this disinformation gets further and further away from the state. And that's why conversations like this are timely and important, because more and more people, rightly or wrongly, get their news, not just their information, not just their funny cat videos, but they get their news from social media platforms. And therefore, if social media platforms are to be used as a mechanism to halt disinformation and as a mechanism to put correct information into the public media and into the public discourse, well, then we absolutely have to look at the men and women who are our first line of defence against this content coming onto social media platforms. And therefore, while it is only a small part of the picture, the role of the content moderator, the attitude and the manner in which they are treated is extremely important, because it tells us a huge amount about what we can expect from social media companies when it comes to combating disinformation, particularly in a time of crisis, but also at all times, but very much especially so at this time, particularly when we see the proliferation of pro-Russian content on our social media platforms. We need to ask ourselves, how does it get there? Number one, is it correct? Which in many instances we know it isn't. Number two, and number three, how can we prevent that information from coming into the public discourse with a tag of respectability, because it has come through a social media platform, and the belief is that it has come through a filter, and yet we see the way that the people who act as the filter are treated tells you, I think, a huge amount about the manner in which disinformation is regarded by social media companies. I apologise for going over my time, and I thank you once again for the invitation.
So once again, thank you to all speakers. We can now proceed for a bit less than half an hour discussion. We have received some questions, and also some questions which have been already voiced through the statements today, which I have written down, and I would like to proceed with. First of all, we should not forget that the main actors in social media are not national companies, but these are global companies like Twitter, Facebook. So it is important for us to identify and discuss what has been the role of the global gatekeepers in this time of military aggression. And I will ask my dear colleague, Professor Kettermann, to comment on that. But the other questions which I would also like to discuss, building on President Ilves's remarks, does freedom of expression extend to states? I think that is one of the fundamental dilemmas, perhaps not dilemmas, perhaps there is a clear answer. And the third cluster of issues or questions could be formulated as, is absolute ban of media channels which voice war propaganda and hatred, is absolute ban justified? One of the most striking comments which I received from our survey was something like this: of course, we should ban RT when they are airing news and online discussions or discussions in the studio, but they are also showing sports. Why not show sports programs and unblock them for that. So I think there are some very clear answers to that. But perhaps now starting from the item of global governors, Professor Ketterman, if you might give us a few insights on the role of global governors, online governors, in this conflict. I'm afraid you are on mute.
But that just goes to show, the importance of who controls the voice in any debate, right? And it is just a fact that communication ecosystems have changed so substantially over the last decade. Today, we are confronted with an online media ecosystem where it is primarily platforms that have the direct opportunity to influence information and communication flows. Now, we've all heard the arguments that they're either too happy to censor stuff, or that they're too lenient to censor stuff, or that they're erring on the right, that they're deleting conservative voices or deleting liberal voices. We've all heard those debates. But empirically, it is extremely hard to provide evidence that there is either a conservative or a liberal bias on platforms. What we know, according to a number of reliable studies, is that a lot of platforms have, and that's a good thing, an anti-disinformation bias. And it is also a fact that spreading disinformation is currently something that conservative accounts do more than liberal accounts, if you allow this generalization. So what we're seeing is an increasingly strong commitment to fight disinformation, and that is a good thing. It's also something that platforms are being pushed towards through activities both on the soft law and the hard law level. Soft law, for instance, the European Union has for quite some time cooperated intensively with platforms in different settings to fight content related to terrorism financing, child exploitation images, and also more recently disinformation. That's the soft law. But there is also increasingly hard law, including the four big acts coming out of Brussels these days: the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the EI Act, and the Data Governance Act. They, taken together, will responsibilize platforms substantially. Platforms will have the obligation, inter alia, to provide risk assessments according in light of the rules which they have for sharing online content. So they will be responsible to show exactly what rules they have and how those rules impact, and including the recommendation algorithms that implement those rules, how they impact individual rights and social cohesion. And I believe that just as the corona pandemic was an important stepping stone towards more responsible platform behavior when it comes to regulating online flows, so the reaction now with regards to Ukraine will also be in retrospect, be seen as a stepping stone towards a more responsible behavior regarding communication flows online. They're not being perfect, no, but we see that the realities of online communication now puts a huge responsibility on platforms that governments and civil society has to control through transparency rules, through accountability, and those are things that a number of the new European laws I've mentioned provide for. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, for these comments. Now I would turn to President Ilves. You were asking the question, does freedom of expression extend to states? Of course, we could circumvent this by saying, well, the state always speaks through individuals. These can be state officials, but these can also be seemingly private individuals who voice certain opinions. So what would be your own reflection on this question? Sometimes it is that you don't ask the question if you don't know the answer.
Well, my personal view is that that states do not have the same rules on freedom of expression, since they have considerably more power than the individual. They have a repressive power, which individuals don't. Overall, I would basically, I go back to Herder. I don't believe in group rights, propagated by Herder and later by Fichte. I'm strictly a Anglo-Franco Enlightenment fellow here. I do not think that states have to follow, rather. States must follow altogether different rules, and one of those rules is respecting the rights of individuals to free expression, which we clearly do not see in the case of the propaganda outlets in Russia or in other authoritarian states. And we should not give them the same kind of rights, and we should not talk about freedom of expression when we talk about states with coercive powers that limit the rights of the individuals within their own states. Simple as that.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to echo or well, we are at least having academic discussion. Anyone would contradict, or we can proceed to other questions. Any one of the panelists? Hard to contradict, I guess. Mrs. Plank, I would like to turn to you. One of the comments which you were making was it is important to keep communication channels open so that people who are living, if you will, beyond or on the other side of this digital Iron Curtain, have access to accurate information. Those of us who have lived in the time of not digital Iron Curtain, but real physical Iron Curtain, know how important it was that the flow of information was on both sides. People getting information and being able to give out information. So, could it be argued or countered that when we allow information, accurate information from the Western democracies to reach ordinary people in Russia and Belarus, shouldn't we give the same benefit to them that they go to TV studios, discuss their views, and people in the West watch them? I don't want to sound provocative, but just as a matter of reciprocal approach. Mrs. Plank.
I hope I understood your suggestion correctly. I think our main focus is to help keep access to information open also to a Russian public that is subjected nearly exclusively to state propaganda. And we are trying to help people who want to inform themselves otherwise, who want to have access to other media, to Western media, but also to Russian media who are producing from exile. We want to keep those information channels open. If your question was on reciprocity, if you meant should we also, of course, allow RT Germany to broadcast everything that happens in Russia into Germany, the answer and here I entirely concur with President Ilves, the answer is no. Of course not. And I think whoever wants to watch RT Germany, for example, can still do so. But somebody who is living in Russia and does not have VPN access, for example, is going to have an increasingly hard time to do so without sanctions. And that is something we are trying to circumvent. We are, amongst other things, working in the G7 framework. You know, we have the G7 presidency right now, on ways and means how free media, not state-owned media, but media from all denominations can work together to circumvent this kind of censorship or wall, if you so want. And and I think legally just the term of freedom of information, the freedom to inform oneself wherever oneself wants to inform, to get information from, is a very high priority on our agenda. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. What I would add, we have been confronted in our study and we have discussed in our group how to justify an absolute ban on legacy media portals and on social media. And to put it in non-legal terms, if you will, imagine you have a violent neighbor who is violent towards his family, and you know that the neighbor is violent towards his family, but the neighbor makes wonderful pancakes, tasty pancakes. You would not go to the neighbor to eat pancakes because the neighbor is violating something for which there is absolute ban. So what we are calling also in our study is to reconsider when, under which circumstances there should be or can be, through policy recommendations, absolute bans on certain media companies if they cross certain threshold. And the threshold can be that these media portals very clearly advocate intrusion into freedoms and values which we in the democratic world consider absolute. Allow me to pose a question both to Louise O'Reilly and Birgit. You were touching upon a very significant aspect, that in today's social media, the moderators very often are outside of the context where something is happening. It is being outsourced. People who are moderating are far away. Might you perhaps add a few comments on that? Because I know, Louise, you felt that you were cut short by our time frame, but here would be an opportunity for you to issue some additional comments. And Birgit, if you would like to echo on that, please.
No, the time was fine. I just talked too much, so that was my fault. So yeah, just in relation to the content moderators, I was very struck by something that Mr. Ketterman said in terms of the communications ecosystem changing. And it's different, and it's not the same as it was when I was young. It's not even the same as it was when a couple of years ago. So it's very fast moving, and as part of my role, I'm a member of the Joint Oireachtas Committee, which is the Parliamentary Committee on Enterprise and Employment, and we had a session with the content moderators, and what really struck me was the extent to which individual members, all parliamentarians, but individual members of the committee who were not aware of the work of the content moderators, they weren't aware of the structure within the social media platforms. So if we're going to have any chance at being able to tackle this information, we're going to have to deepen our understanding of this information ecosystem, because it is very, very different. We cannot simply look at the masthead, see the name of the newspaper and know this is a decent publication, because the information comes at us in many, many forms. I mean, it comes in a 10-second video on TikTok, or a 2-minute video on Facebook, or through Twitter threads, and so therefore the changing ecosystem, the fact that the ecosystem has changed so substantially, but also that change continues, I think it is really important, not just for parliamentarians, but definitely for parliamentarians, that we would have an understanding of that ecosystem, because without that understanding and without the capacity to be able to delve into these networks, we won't be able to combat disinformation because we simply won't be able to see how that disinformation is coming into the public discourse. And we have seen this in COVID. We have seen large-scale dissemination of disinformation, and we need to look at what we use to stop that. But I think, yes, we do need to have that understanding because it's subtle. You know, not everything that comes from, as I think it was President Eva-Maria that said it, that yes, some of these programs show politics, but they also show sport. So it's not as easy as simply saying this publication and all that comes from it, because these outlets, they don't just have many outlets in different countries. They also have multiple social media accounts, and they use the platforms, and they use them very cleverly. So we need to be able to look into that ecosystem to see how it works, to examine that network, and then to know where to deploy those resources. Then we know the content moderators as those resources, they need to be adequately paid, because if you're talking about silencing people and you're talking about disinformation and freedom of expression, then there needs to be some understanding that the people who are on the front line can be empowered to raise those concerns. And as I've said, with the social media companies putting the content moderators at a distance from themselves, and often that work is outsourced and then outsourced again, so it gets further and further away from the centre and from so therefore the voice of the content moderator and all of the people working within this ecosystem, they need to be able to express. They need to be able to vocalise when they see disinformation, or to have that open dialogue. And the system as it is configured at the moment, certainly in the Republic of Ireland, the system as it is configured at the moment does not do that.
Thank you. We are approaching, we still have now our last 8 minutes. So I'm changing the plan a bit, and yes, Birgit, I will give word to you immediately. We'll be able to give word to everybody just for the final comments. 1 minute, not much longer. And please address the matter whether you think the core principles of human rights, fundamental rights, have withstood this aggression, and if there is a need to reconceptualize anything. But starting from you, Birgit, please.
Thanks. Do you want me to respond to your initial question or to make my final comments?
Both, please. Both.
Right. Okay. So, just in response to your previous question, I perhaps connect this with the point raised by President Ilves. Of course, rights have historically been conceived as individual rights, but states have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill and promote human rights. And linking this with the question about content moderators and about the wider media ecosystem that we are living with, these rights these obligations should now extend to private corporations, including media platforms. And I for one, am certainly uneasy by the power of media platforms and especially their ability to regulate what conventionally has been a right and a preserve of the state and of those that we as citizens can hold accountable. So in that context, I can move on then to my final comments. I think the concerns over disinformation and war propaganda are legitimate, but I think what we need are a very granular analysis and perspectives on the way that regulation and bans interfere with the right to freedom of expression and the circumstances and the conditions where this interference is proportionate and time limited and lawful. And I want to introduce just maybe one final point into the discussion that we haven't really touched on yet. So we're talking about bans, and we're talking about hard law that seeks to regulate media output. But I think we also need to engage much more in the conversation about media literacy and political and civic literacy, so that we can critically engage with this information even before we get to the point where we're even having a conversation about bans. So this is my final point. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. Professor Viljanen, any last comments, please?
Thank you. My last comment goes to in this. We are in this very extraordinary situation, but we should also think about what would happen in the future on this information. European Court of Human Rights made a very important judgment just a few days ago in NIT versus Moldova case. And one of the main thing I think at the moment would be that perhaps now it's just like in the case of Greece, that European countries would make an interstate complaint against Russia. This is one of these sort of time. We have now 6 months where we can still make these complaints against Russia. So I think this is one of these sort of key moments for states to consider interstate complaint. Thank you.
Thank you. I will turn to President Ilves, and on a personal note, if you allow, you have been very kind to participate in 2 webinars. Last year, we had the COVID crisis. You were speaking here. Today, you are a panelist in this webinar. So my personal note will be, we all very much hope that there will not be another global crisis which will prompt us to have the 3rd study and discussion of something which is horribly affecting mankind. But always a pleasure to have you as a member of our network's board. President Ilves, please, any final comments from you?
Well, thank you. I thought you were going to say that you hope there's not another crisis, so I'll have to come and comment again. But something I didn't get to, but I think one of the things we need to look at is actually the combination of state-run media and social media, which is that at the same time that Russia has banned Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so there's no discussion, those same outlets continue to push and promote and allow to appear the Russian foreign ministry, spreading some of the most obnoxious kinds of propaganda, insulting propaganda. The Russian embassy Twitter account here is brutal in its crudity. We don't do anything about that. I think there should be some sense of reciprocity, that why if Twitter and Facebook are not available within Russia, why should Russian official state outlets appear on these things? But anyway, that's just a personal kind of personal peeve of mine. But thank you. Anyway, thank you. I think it was a great discussion, and I hope we have more of them, even without another crisis.
Thank you. I hope next panel will be on more idealistic and forward-looking items. Gregor, final comment, 30 seconds, if you will, please.
Yes, I'm going to be quick. Thank you very much for the chance to comment again. So I want to go to an institutional notion and say that as we see that the Russian Federation is now more than ever openly opposing the international human rights order embodied by the UN, the Council of Europe and the OSCE, we should be reminded that these organizations, as the guardians of human rights, need to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you. Real quick, Professor Kettermann, 30 seconds.
Human rights concern us all, and we need to be aware that private actors have become extremely influential in deciding about how we can exercise these human rights. Of course, this should not be the end of public involvement. We need to make sure that there is a public accountability, that there is a control by public authorities and civil society regarding the way that private decisions impact how individual rights and social cohesion are discussed and impacted by communication flows. Thank you.
We have the last minute. I would like to thank all contributors to the study, all panelists, all viewers. We will make this recording available on our website. The report is already publicly available. What can I say? The sun will be coming out for everybody one day. The aggression will end one day, and we will stand firm and united behind the democratic human rights values which have brought us here. Thank you, and have a good day.